Welcome, world, to another edition of Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We are here on yet another Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Malcolm, what's going on with you, man?
Oh, not too much, man. Just, another day, another dollar.
Another day, another dollar, as they say. Well, of course, as we always do here on Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm, want to preview the conversation at hand for this episode, which is another intro, technically part 2, to investing, but specifically covering making socially conscious investments. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. But before that, a bit of life news, and I have a bit to share. This past weekend, I went back to Syracuse University for the first time since I graduated. When I first graduated, I couldn't have left Syracuse faster because I was so done with going to school and doing homework and stuff like that. But went back for an event that they do every 3 years called Coming Back Together, which is a celebration of sorts or homecoming of sorts for Black and Latino alumni of the school. This was my first time doing that, and also my first time being back to Syracuse since I left, and it was a really good time.
Everything was still where you left it?
Everything, for the most part, was still where I left it. There were some things I wanted to see that I didn't get a chance to see. Met a lot of, like, as they say, old heads, people who graduated in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who are actually cool people. I
don't know if you're supposed to say actually.
I mean, so this was interesting. I actually had a conversation about this earlier, or mentioned this earlier to my wife. I said it's kind of crazy when, as an adult, you step out of that young people stage and you enter, like, even though this person's 55, they're still my peer.
Right.
And they consider me their peer in the way that they're talking to me, in the way that they're addressing me. I just happen to be a few years younger than them.
But you still better call them Miss or Miss so-and-so.
Well, with certain people, you absolutely do. There was a Miss Mitchell, who I remember during my time up there.
Miss Mitchell could be 9 years older than me, and she still wants her credit.
Well, Miss Mitchell was an actual Miss Mitchell, so I made sure to call her that. But also had some interesting things. Went to a football game. Had an interesting time there. This is me standing in front of, for those who are watching, standing in front of the football stadium called the Carrier Dome in Syracuse. And then also stood with the mascot. But the highlight photograph of the weekend, I got to meet and dap up Mr. Heartthrob himself, Taye Diggs.
Y'all are the same size. That's the thing that I took away from.
That's your takeaway? We the same height? That's really jacked up. I was going to focus on our smiles or something like that.
Well, okay. Well, that's fine too. But my first time seeing that picture, I actually had to chuckle a little bit.
He was like, dang, I know how tall Ben is.
It looked like, like the light heavyweight matchup with Mayweather and whoever. I was like, man, that looked like, a fight photo.
After the fight happened and we happy we're getting our money.
Right.
It's ridiculous. Also in Manage Your Damn Money personal news, Malcolm, you tweeted me this past weekend to rub in my face a certain piece of news. Why don't you tell people what happened?
Absolutely, because those of you who didn't catch the last show yet, I'm going to assume you're going to go back and download it. But for those of you who didn't catch the last show where Ben was being a hater, I am in the process of training to run 100 miles. And no, I'm joking. It's not 100 miles. But I told Ben I was running a marathon, and because he's being a hater, I had to share with him my progress. So I got 8 straight miles this weekend.
And he tweeted it at me as opposed to just texting me, which I guess is a public thing, like you did.
No, this shame has to be public. This can't be just between you, me, and Steve Jobs. This has to be like a public thing that actually,
Sure. And if people don't know, I have bet Malcolm, sort of. So I basically said if Malcolm crosses the finish line under his own power, the 26.2 miles, when you do the race in November, I will hand over $100. And so that's the bet of sorts. I don't get anything if he doesn't cross. Just the satisfaction of being a hater proved correct. And that's good enough for me.
Which is everything for a hater.
Absolutely. We want to remind folks you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. In this episode of Manager Dan Money, we're talking about we're doing another intro to investing, part 2 to our intro to investing, making socially conscious investments. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that a little later in the show. But as we do in every show, it is time for headlines. Interesting news that came out that everyone's been talking about, especially in the personal finance world. The Equifax website secured by the worst username and password possible.
Right.
As people must have heard by now, Equifax, which is one of the 3 credit grading bureaus or credit bureaus in the United States, they basically handle what your credit score is. Had a vulnerability in their technical systems, which exposed 143 Americans and Canadians as well. 143 million Americans and Canadians information to hackers. Right. So hackers presumably have in their hands personal information, which may include obviously like your first and last name, your middle name that no one knows about, and then also your potentially your social security number, your address, and all those things that people can get to doing some pretty terrible business with the information with. And so in our initial review of kind of what's been going on, I think people know basically what's happened. I looked at a Bloomberg report last night. And Equifax learned about the breach of its computer systems in March, almost 5 months before the date it publicly disclosed, according to 3 people familiar with the situation.
Strike one.
The revelation that the 118-year-old credit reporting agency suffered 2 major incidents in the span of a few months adds to a mounting crisis at the company, which is subject to multiple investigations now, and announced the retirement of 2 of its top security executives on Friday. So the people tasked with making sure information is secure were essentially dismissed. They called it retirement, but it was like retire or get fired. And then also the revelation of March breach will complicate the company's efforts to explain a series of unusual stock sales by Equifax executives. If it's shown that these executives sold their stocks with knowledge that either or both of these breaches could damage the company, they could be vulnerable to charges of insider trading. And that's just a little bit of information. But Malcolm, you pulled a story that came out that you saw very recently with even more updates.
Yeah, so I mean, this happened within like the last 3 hours, I guess it is now at this point. But the state of Massachusetts has actually filed a lawsuit already on behalf of its constituents against Equifax because of what they refer to as the unknown harm that has already been done to their residents. So they're expecting more than half of the adult population of the state of Massachusetts has been affected by this Equifax breach. Absolutely. That's just one state.
Right.
So Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, in conjunction with their attorney general, their state's attorney in Massachusetts, was the first state to file, but that's just going to open up the floodgates for everybody else. And so this thing isn't just contained to the United States either. Canada
was affected. I think one other country here, Argentina, yeah.
So you got international issues now. I mean, this looks to me like, for those of you who were around back then, or maybe were some sort of business student, this looks a lot like the whole Enron scandal.
Wow, you've taken it real far back.
It looks to be as bad, if not worse, when we find out than Enron.
Right. What happened with Enron again? I don't really remember.
Well, basically, they were like manipulating their accounting arm was manipulating the books to look like they were earning a profit long after they stopped.
Okay, making a profit.
Right. So their stock price kept going up. Okay. Their executives kept selling the stock.
Right.
So that they could sell before the public knew that they were actually losing money along the way.
Right.
So for years and years and years, they were making it look like on paper everything's fine.
Right.
The employees were all holding Enron stock, and then once the company finally plummeted because they couldn't fake it anymore, everybody was left, with worthless stock except the executives who were in the know the entire time.
Right.
This looks a lot like that same kind of scenario.
Yeah, not only that, it's just a terrible situation when it comes to, I think one of the issues was the portal using one of the portals that were like breached. Apparently the password and the username was like admin. Right. And that was the one that secured the customer's stuff in Argentina. And I think so people can understand how big of a deal this is, Equifax is one of 3 credit bureaus that check everyone's credit in the United States.
Right.
So literally, like, everyone in the United States, in theory, is vulnerable to whatever transpired here. And I think this kind of brings me to a bigger question of what does the breach of but this personally identifying information suggests about the vulnerability of all of us as consumers through the financial process. Like, we exist in this online space, we use online stuff all the time. It feels like, especially because despite however stupid it was that they were taken advantage of in this way,
right,
everyone is vulnerable, and there's almost no way to prevent your own being vulnerable to these kinds of things.
But the biggest problem with this, aside from the wrongdoing by the company itself, right, all that aside, the biggest problem is none of us asked to be one of Equifax's customers.
Man.
Nobody signed up and said, Equifax, I want you to monitor me from now on and report my whereabouts and my misdeeds or my good
my missed
history.
bills.
I didn't ask Equifax to do jack.
Nope.
So now I'm exposed potentially to hacking and identity theft, all because I involuntarily was added to some roster somewhere.
Right.
That is the biggest problem. That's where kind of the rub really comes in from a legal standpoint, as far as damage to consumers.
Right.
So even if I wasn't actually affected, like somebody stole my identity and went and bought a car with my social security number, the fact that it potentially could have happened and I didn't ask Equifax to hold me as part of their customer base,
right,
I've already got an issue.
Does that call into question the whole system of credit checking? And
so you must have read my notes. I had it, like, as I was reading through this thing and we were preparing for the show, I was like, this right here opens up the opportunity for somebody far smarter than me when it comes to computer technology to replace the need for social security numbers at all.
Ooh.
So that's a technology, social security numbers.
Oh, yeah.
Damn. So that like came about like 70 years ago.
Right.
We're not using anything that we used to use 70 years ago.
Man,
we got electric cars.
Right.
Like, like Henry Ford would be rolling in his grave if he saw what Elon Musk was trying to do to the auto industry. Like, why are we still using that technology? Because nobody proved it to be obsolete just yet.
Or that system.
Right. Like, why is that the thing that determines my credit worthiness or my ability to go claim retirement benefits? Or what else to use a social security number for? Like, nothing at this point.
Right.
So I think this opens the opportunity for somebody who is like really on top of this to develop some sort of, platform where we don't need social security numbers anymore. And 5 years from now, little kids are like, what's that?
Right.
Like,
what's a social security card?
Very good. See.
That's interesting. Two, I wonder, is this like the new thing that we all have to be mindful of? Like, is this like the new bank robbery? Go get some digital information and then do your worst with it?
I think we already needed to be aware of that. Like the fact that there's folks out there filing fake tax returns with your social security number.
Right.
And the fact that folks are out there going to hospitals and giving somebody else's identity to get care.
Right.
And then the hospital bill is now on your social and not mine.
Right.
Like the fact that all those things are even possible and have been happening for the last 5 years.
Right.
That tells you right there that we should have been already safeguarding our information, changing passwords, staying on top of your credit monitoring, all that kind of stuff. But now this just makes it even more obvious that, like, you should be paying attention to what happens with, your information and who you're giving it to and how you're giving it to them. Like, if I call a place and they ask me for anything more than the last 4 digits of my social, I'm like, no.
Right, yeah.
Like, you should have enough information from just the last 4 of my last name to do what I need you to do.
Right, absolutely. Real quick, we're going to remind people you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. We're talking about Equifax, the data breach, and the implications for us as consumers. The next thing I think it's important that we really quickly hit is some quick suggestions for keeping your information secure. I know we all deal with the internet on a daily basis for work and other things, but there are slight ways to mitigate risk. You can't totally eliminate these kinds of risks, but you can mitigate them. So a couple of them just right here are limit the number of entities with access to your bank or personal information. So that means that when people ask for your bank information, your credit card information, or social security card especially, you need to really scrutinize who's asking. Make sure you do your research, understand what website and portal you're using. Also, utilize third-party payment apps, so things like PayPal, and other things that keep a layer between you, your money, and the person you're dealing with.
Right.
And also, obviously, this is a really thing that we haven't really talked about much on the show. Using credit cards for online transactions and not debit cards. And the reason that is because typically with a bank, if they find fraudulent charges on your credit card, they just credit that back to you without any issue. But when you talk about your debit card information being stolen and money being withdrawn, once that money's withdrawn, it's very difficult to get it back or to claim that you didn't make those charges. And then finally, obviously, like I said, scrutinize the vendor and purpose for whom which you give access to your social security number and those kinds of personal pieces of information. That should really be like at the top of your list. Like, no one needs it unless you absolutely need it. In that case, then you can consider like, okay, this is one more person that I'm adding to the list of people who have my social security card, who, if they were hacked in this case, they could use my information to do damage, financial or otherwise.
So this might be a little bit OD, but another way to kind of combat that, especially with online shopping, like for the folks that buy things from like Instagram boutiques, like to me, you never know what kind of shadiness could happen with the,
or what kind of product or platform they're using.
So I think maybe you buy one of those Visa gift cards that you have to prepay. Wow. It has a phone. It has a card number attached to it, but as soon as you spend the money, it's gone, and they can't get any additional money from you.
That's a good one.
So maybe you use those to keep from having to worry about the sketchiness of, this isn't Amazon. I'm buying this from China or Russia or somewhere where I may not ever see my money again.
Right.
Like I said, it's a little extreme, but it's better than having to deal with identity theft.
That makes perfect sense. We want to remind people you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. Today's conversation at hand, another intro to investing, part 2, making socially conscious investments. That's what's coming up next. But before we take this music break, we're going to remind you that you can always listen to Manage Your Damn Money on Apple Podcasts. Simply search Manage Your Damn Money. You can also find us on SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/Manage Your Damn Money. And of course, leave us a review on either platform. Those things help us go up in the ratings. If you have questions, and I want to make this note, if you have questions, comments, concerns, or ideas about what we should cover on the show, send us an email at info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. We're actually going to be planning a show that's going to be entirely produced by our listeners. We already have some suggestions in, and we'll be actually pushing that on social media soon. So send your suggestions in. We want to hear from you. This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money. That was another track from our executive producer of this show and co-creator of this show, Mr. Beats by Beeman. You can listen to his music, find clips of his music, and get in contact with him at Beats by Beeman. And if you are a musician or artist of some kind of yourself and your stuff is good and you want it to play during our podcast, just send it to us and we'll see if it's good. And if it's good, we'll run it. So as we mentioned before, this episode's conversation at hand, intro to investing part 2, making socially conscious investments. So we call it part 2 because we had an episode that we covered a little while back, which was like a very basic intro to investing.
And if you haven't heard it, go download it, listen to it after this one.
Absolutely. But on this episode of Manage Your Damn Money, we're taking a look at specific types of investing, or a specific type of investing, socially conscious or responsible investing, to understand why and how people make investments in companies whose mission takes the extra step in contributing to society. And so real quick, Malcolm, to kind of launch us off on this conversation, we pulled a story that was an August 2017 piece on visualcapitalist.com, which explores how millennials' preference for making sustainable investments is starting to go mainstream.
Right.
The headline was, "Millennials are investing with a purpose and it's changing wealth management." If you've been paying attention, the story says, to your social media feeds or most news outlets, it should be pretty clear to you that millennials seem to be, quote unquote, killing just about everything from Applebee's to the entire golf industry, and maybe even one day the car industry, at least car ownership industry as we know it. Millennials want to put their money towards companies and funds that are helping to do things like alleviate poverty, protect the environment, or further human rights around the world. They want to generate return on investment in both financial and social spheres. Actually, interestingly enough, this term this term I'm going to say AUM over the last decade or so, the amount of assets under management, so that's AUM. For sustainable investments. So sustainable investments mean like responsible investments,
right.
Investments that help the community, so to speak, or whatever, has ballooned to a whopping $8.72 trillion in the U.S. for 2016, which is a huge number of people who are investing in sustainable investments. And then since 2014, that's a 33% increase. And even more interestingly enough, sustainable investments now make up 22% of the $40 trillion total amount of assets under management in the United States. So 22% of $40 trillion being managed in the United States is of quote unquote sustainable investments.
Right. So socially responsible investing.
Absolutely. So what was your first idea or understanding of construction in your mind of sustainable investments? Like, you've been the as an investment professional for a while now. When was your introduction to this? When was your first experience with it?
You know what? Actually, it came from a non-millennial. A doctor client of mine, she's a dentist.
That's the same thing, right?
When they make the distinction, so I'm making the distinction. I got to stay employed.
Right.
So, in having a conversation with her, initial conversation, she mentioned that she didn't want to own stock in anything that killed anybody, that caused lung cancer. So, cigarette companies, and no alcohol, tobacco, or firearms.
Right. Okay.
Like that was her criteria. And immediately I looked at her and I said, well, then you're not going to make any money. And I'm not an old person, I'm a millennial, and my response was, how could you make money like that? Right. So that was, I don't know, 4 years ago maybe.
Right.
And that was like my initial interaction with sustainable investing.
Okay.
And then in doing research to figure out how to accommodate her preferences, I came to find out that there's really an entire market for sustainable investing, socially responsible investing, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
And I was kind of shocked. And then I come to realize, like, this is actually becoming a thing, to your point.
Right.
In the last couple of years, a third of all of the investing population in our cohort wants to be in socially responsible investments, which is only going to increase as people get their hands on more money.
That's interesting. I think I had my first experience with socially responsible investing earlier on in my teenage days, understanding that like people have a certain perspective of like fossil fuels and like you said, firearms. I think in my own coming of age, understanding what it means to invest, I knew that those were things that if you invest in them, you're making somewhat of a statement about it feeling like it's okay for that to be a part of society.
You're literally putting your money where your mouth is.
You're putting your money where your mouth is, and you're putting your money where other people might say that's a social ill of sorts. So if you were to invest in like a gun making company, many could argue that's a social ill, or the argument could be made that's a social ill. So why would you put your money in that? Some people might feel like, well, to make money off of it. Right. And other people are like, no, my heart doesn't feel quite right about that. But according to data from Morgan Stanley and Morningstar, SRI, or socially responsible investments, can outperform non-SRI funds in periods of 1, 3, 5, and 10 years. So as you said, Malcolm, it's a growing space. And according to this information, in some cases, it outperforms regular stuff.
Right. And well, part of it, from what I understand, the logic behind it is that by doing good, you attract more people who do business with you, even if you charge a premium for your product, because they feel good about the fact that they're supporting a company that does good.
Absolutely.
So then in return, folks are willing to invest in that stock after they've even bought your products, because now they feel a real attachment to the company that's doing good. Right. So it does make a lot of sense. It's intriguing to me. Like I personally get tired of everybody. Every time I read an article, they try and paint the millennial generation as this group of tree huggers that every time they talk about what millennials' needs are, it's like they want things that make them feel good. They want to feel like they're making a difference in causes, blah, blah, blah. But apparently there's some truth to it.
Right.
Like just in terms of this particular substance, like this group investing wants to actually feel good about what they're doing and make a difference. And I was like shocked, honestly, when I really looked at the math behind who all is doing this.
Are you doing any social? Actually, I'm gonna ask that question later. But the next story that we pulled for this was actually a more concrete definition for what it means to do socially responsible investing. And so we pulled an article from Investopedia, Malcolm's favorite website, that says while investing in big name arms manufacturers may produce a nice return in a person's portfolio, it can be disturbing to know that the weapons being manufactured eventually become a payload in some foreign country or used for the death of humans. By not investing in stocks that do business in areas such as gambling and the manufacturing of weapons, tobacco, drugs, and alcohol products, individuals can impose their own social and moral values on their portfolio, which is what you just mentioned with that doctor, dentist client that you had. Furthermore, people can choose to invest in companies that they believe are making valuable social and environmental contributions to society, such as educational companies or companies that make an effort to curb pollution and protect the environment. So now, Malcolm, do you have currently any folks who do, as clients, as a licensed financial advisor, do you have any folks who you would consider like socially responsible investors?
I have one who I just mentioned that said, we need to build a whole portfolio around this.
Okay.
And we'll get into it a little bit later, but the advent of funds that are specifically socially responsible made the job easier.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you have to go pick out 100 different stocks that are companies that have that socially responsible tag.
Right.
But separately from that, what I've noticed to that point, younger clients want at least one socially responsible investment in their portfolio.
Okay.
So they may not be all the way 100% there,
Sure,
willing to make that commitment because, like you mentioned,
we want to make some money.
We want to make some money,
right.
And arms dealers make money during war, and polluters of the environment make money.
Right.
Shale fracking and
right.
all that kind of oil production type stuff. Those are the companies that make the money.
Right.
But we want to see at least one fund in there that makes us feel like at least we're doing some good and not as much harm. But for people still kind of, I'd say confused maybe, or just a little bit fuzzy on exactly what socially responsible companies would look like, I think a relevant example of a recent story would be Uber.
Okay.
So Uber, as you know, has had their issues around discrimination.
A lot of PR issues.
They've had their issues around not hiring women to the upper echelons of management and so on. And I saw an article that had the headline, Uber's search for a female CEO has been narrowed down to 3 men. And I'm like, man, talk about a nightmare headline, right? But all of a sudden, folks are kind of running for the hills, trying to get away from them, saying,
right.
I'm not going to take their I'm not going to use their car sharing service anymore.
Right.
I want to feel like I'm supporting a company that does better.
Right.
So now I'm moving over to a competitor.
Right.
Or you have the folks that say, I'm leaving the company and I'm going to work somewhere else that does more good.
Right.
Something like that. So that's an example, I think, of a company that's not operating socially responsibly and is seeing the impact of folks, again, putting their money where their mouth is.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you ever seen, just in your career, not necessarily clients of yours, but clients elsewhere, or in the news or anywhere else, where people actually have deep pockets and the desire to keep their portfolios clean? Like, could do those things? No. Have you seen those two at the same time?
I've read about them, but I haven't ever met any of these people. So right. I'm really curious, like, who and where these people are, because as you know, money talks, right? So the people who really have the most influence in this country,
right.
if they really were that interested in making sure that folks do good as a company, that right. they do good in the community, then they would put their money there, and we'd see those companies make a shift, and we haven't seen that
right.
in any substantial way. Like, I haven't met any of those people as clients. So no, and that's kind of the challenge, I think, to the whole socially responsible movement, until you really start to see folks with that kind of money and power and sway make that demand.
Right.
You don't see that huge shift happen,
Sure.
in front of you.
Right. So I want to track back to, you mentioned Uber having serious problems when it comes to their business and news coming out of their business, and the reaction that, millennials in particular have to that kind of way of doing things.
Right.
Do you think that the millennial generation will have a different expectations of companies? And that, like, back in the day, it was cool if you like dumped your waste into the lake. That was like, all right. But now we're in an era, especially for this new generation, where there's somewhat of an expectation to build philanthropy into your business model.
Absolutely.
And also an expectation that you're doing things ethically, and in a way that's not harmful to society in one way or another. Do you think by the time we're like 50, that companies will have fully embraced some of these more socially conscious models of doing business?
I think they have to. You either adapt or you die. And I think part of that is because corporate CEOs are now becoming public figures in a way they never had to worry about before. Like, think back to the former owner of the LA Clippers, Don Sterling, and that recording that came out of him using expletives and making, racial comments. There was a time when that wouldn't have made you have, like, they forced a billionaire to sell his business.
Yep.
So, like, think about that. Because of social media, because of the fact that, like, TMZ is a thing and they put that recording out there and then it blew up all over social media, like, that now means that you as the owner, you as the CEO of this company, have to put on a good face in public at all times and can't get caught slipping, for lack of a better term,
at all.
Because as soon as social media gets wind of it, people will move their money to a competitor and support elsewhere. And then so there goes your share price, and there goes your bonus, and there goes your corporate jet and all those other things you enjoy.
Like the Los Angeles Lakers. Anyway, continue.
The Los Angeles Lakers is an easy one, but I would assume, to go off topic for 2 seconds, if you're not already a Lakers fan and you live in LA, something's wrong with you, and you'd probably go root for the Kings or somebody. But
shout out to Courtney Reddix, who's been a friend and Clippers fan since high school, and I never understood why. It was like, that's when Lamar Odom played for the LA Clippers. Anyway, we want to remind people that you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money. Today's conversation at hand, Intro to Investing, Part 2, Making Socially Conscious Investments. We're going to take another music break, hear another piece from Mr. Beats by B-Man, but when we come back, we'll continue talking about what it means to make socially conscious investments and what it looks like when you see it. This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back.
Listen. Now listen.
Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. That was another musical piece by Mr. Beats by B-Man. He's the executive producer of this show, co-creator of Manage Your Damn Money. Today's conversation at hand for me and Malcolm, Intro to Investing, Part 2, because we did a Part 1 earlier, making socially conscious investments. Tom Shoes and New York-based eyewear company Warby Parker have become symbols of business success in the sharing-based economy. Tom donates a pair of shoes for every pair it sells, and then Warby Parker, much in the same way, does the same with eyeglasses. Or I think I read it once, and it's something like they provide a certain dollar amount of eye healthcare services per person.
In addition to the glasses?
No, I think it used to be glasses, and I think now they've changed it to like some package of care of glasses.
Sustainable investing isn't sustainable.
Yeah, so I gotta check. It's been a while, but last time I bought a pair, I went and looked, and it had slightly changed from 1-for-1, and it was more like it was actually a more comprehensive set of healthcare for people living in like underdeveloped countries. But both of these companies represent new models And if they were public companies, because I believe both are private companies, right?
Still
private companies. Opportunities to make socially conscious investments. Quick question for you before we move on, Malcolm. Millennials are pushing this model of social good being built into the business model, like we just discussed.
Right.
Do you see this impacting the structure of businesses, in particular public companies? Because public companies, once you become public, everything becomes about the quarterly earnings, quarterly income, and pushing sales and everything else such that investors can make every last dollar possible. Does that theory meld with a socially conscious approach like, say, Tom's or Warby Parker? Like, if they went public and suddenly had public regular people shareholders, their values might be turned on their head, where they're saying, we got to get rid of this philanthropy, it costs too much, so on and so forth. So does that will we see Tom's shoes and the like kind of permeate into the culture of companies in that way?
I would say yes, 3 different ways. So yes, because even if you are privately held, you're still a public company.
Okay.
So where I was just talking about Uber and the Clippers and social media ruining the world again. Even though you're a privately held company, what you do behind closed doors becomes public because of social media.
Sure.
So that's one. We still have access to you even if you aren't on the exchanges. Right. And then also, yes, because I can encourage you to go public because I want to be able to buy shares of your company, and I don't care if you make some bad moves to increase the profitability of the company, or I don't want you to make bad moves to increase the profitability of the company, because I feel good about the fact that I own a Warby Parker or a Tom's. And so I don't want you to feel the necessity to make bad moves. I just want you to make a little bit of a profit, and I'm going to own the company because it makes me feel good about owning the company.
Absolutely.
And then the third piece is, as a direct investor, maybe one of the people you're talking about who's a big money heavyweight, they come to you and say, I want to take you guys public because I want to put my money behind a company that I feel good about. And that then makes, a big difference, because you're not as worried about your shareholders, because you already have a good bit coming in from this new investor. So I do think absolutely things have already changed, and we will see them change a little bit more. A couple of companies that folks probably don't even realize they interact with on a regular basis are Apple, Google, Qualcomm, Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
Those companies are all socially responsible.
Okay.
They meet the different guidelines to qualify.
Right.
And so, you can still, to the point we were making before, make decent money, earn a decent return, while investing in a company that does, as they like to say, does the most good, quote unquote.
Absolutely. And another story we pulled for this story explained that it was a 2014 Los Angeles Times article by Tom Petruno, which explored the downside of socially responsible investing, or at least it had that in there. It mentioned that socially responsible investing segment of money management has been around since the 70s, but its growth has exploded over the last decade. And by some estimates, like I said before, now covers more than $6 trillion in invested assets. And I listed some other numbers earlier in the show. But in the 1980s, most socially responsible mutual funds simply avoided stocks of so-called vice industries. So like we said before, gambling, alcohol, cigarettes, and weapons. All other stocks were fair game. But as people age, the fear of outliving their money can trump the willingness to sacrifice personal financial gain for the greater good. And then another piece of information from the story, it said over the last 10 years, the average U.S. socially responsible stock mutual fund has trailed the benchmark Standard & Poor's 500 index, so the S&P 500, according to investment research firm Morningstar. But then again, many funds that don't screen stocks for social benefits also have lagged behind the market overall, not necessarily a result of the funds being socially responsible. So it's kind of like it could be that, or maybe has nothing to do with that. And some of the most widely held stocks in socially responsible mutual funds are also some of the most profitable in the U.S. So as you mentioned, Apple, Qualcomm, Google, Johnson & Johnson, these are things that are actually held in socially responsible portfolios and mutual funds. So here are some interesting questions, and you got to do a good job of explaining this, because I had to think for this to make sense when I was writing it out. But there are some unexpected sometimes consequences of socially responsible investments.
Right.
And one of them can be used, I think, the best example we can give is the use of fossil fuels as an example. that when downward pressure on fossil fuels presents a situation where if everyone who's socially responsible doesn't buy a particular stock, or even worse, they pull out of a stock because it's not socially responsible, it'll drive down the price of that stock and then allow people to buy at a cheaper price. And then when market factors necessitate that stock price rise again, those people have now made the money off of that discount buy of the stock that they made.
Right.
And that would be an unintended consequence because people are getting rich off of that position that you essentially sold.
People who are already rich and
Right.
are in the know are making money off that discounted position. Yes, to an extent.
Okay.
So what we saw through the Obama administration was a complete shift, if not, a partial shift, if not complete, to sustainable energy.
Right.
Things like wind energy, solar energy. Like, think about all the houses you ride past now that have solar energy panels on top
Absolutely.
of the houses. That all came because the Obama administration put out subsidies that
Right.
offered people a rebate to basically save the environment.
Right.
Or think about all the people you see driving hybrids. I get pissed off. You hear me say this all the time. All the people who have a reserved parking spot for owning a hybrid. That is one of the things that makes me the most upset.
That's hilarious.
I understand you need special parking spaces for charging an electric vehicle,
You such a Grinch, man.
but you don't need a special parking spot
At the
for
front.
driving a hybrid car.
Right. Okay.
Expected moms, they need a special parking spot. Handicapped people, they need a special parking spot.
Right.
Hybrid car drivers need to park in the back, just so I don't have to hear them brag about how they're saving the environment because they drive a hybrid car. But anyway, enough of my diatribe today. But that's an example, though, because it is sustainable to go toward green energy, less pollutive things, because as you keep hearing, the oil market is like disappearing.
Right,
It's
yeah.
becoming a thing of the past. Oil used to be at like $100 a barrel. Now
Right.
it's somewhere around 50.
50, yeah.
And they're lucky if they get that.
Right.
I don't think that's, a trend that we'll see reversed. I think
Right.
that's really like here to stay. And that all came within the last 8 years through
Right.
the Obama administration and all of these different policies that were there
Right.
to make sure that folks really took advantage of renewable energy.
Policies and incentives.
So I think it really is a thing that's here to stay, whether we like it or not.
Right. What's the impact of a person abstaining from certain investments and not taking part in those investments? So we mentioned like someone who is ready to invest. What's the result of not investing somewhere where you could potentially make some money in the long term?
See, it'll prove itself out eventually, right?
Okay.
We'll find out in the long run. But unfortunately, that's a bridge that you need to know what's on the other side before you cross it. And unfortunately, with investing, we have no idea.
Right.
So I think kind of like where I was saying, I have some folks that are like, we just want to have one thing in the portfolio that makes us feel good and we can point to and brag about.
Right.
I think that might be a little bit better approach, tiptoe into it and not necessarily go 100% 0 to 100.
Right.
But what I've seen kind of as a trend, as a financial advisor, I do have a couple of different companies who I manage the 401k for. And because the companies are small enough, I actually get direct conversation from the employees at the companies.
Okay.
What I have seen is an uptick in folks asking for socially responsible funds inside of their 401k.
Oh, wow.
So maybe you don't go out and actually buy stock yourself in
Right.
a self-directed investment account,
Right.
but your way to have that to influence some change is to invest in your 401k in these companies.
Right.
And then you really have, again, a chance to feel like you're doing some good. And if you are an employee of a company that has few enough employees that you
Right.
have that kind of access to your HR person,
Right.
you do have that level of influence. So
Absolutely.
companies actually have to start taking their workforce seriously and providing those kind of things, because apparently people really do feel really good about
Right.
that kind of stuff, especially things tied to animals.
Absolutely, like PETA and all those guys.
Like, dude, the amount of money that people in our cohort spend on animal related expenses is like befuddling.
I've always felt like it's a child having an animal. In
It
your
might
house,
as well be.
particularly.
Like, I've actually had to take it seriously as I'm putting together financial plans for younger families. Like, they want to plan for expenses related to their animals. And I, being an old man, wanted to kind of like laugh it off and like, whatever, man. Like, this is a serious thing. Like, my pet insurance gets paid right after my health insurance gets paid.
Wow,
like
man.
$60, $75, $100 a month gets paid right after I pay to insure myself and my family.
We should dedicate at least a segment of this show to what it takes to raise a pet.
Oh my God.
There we go. And on that note, we want to remind people you're listening and watching Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. Today's conversation at hand, we're talking about making socially conscious investments. But when we come back, we're going to go through a couple of things, including how to recognize a socially responsible investment and how to actually make socially responsible investments. We're going to take another listen to another piece by Beats by Beeman. We want to remind you, if you have questions or concerns and want to submit an idea to the show for us to cover, just send it to us at info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We will be right back. Welcome back to Manage Your Damn Money. That was another piece by our in-house producer, Mr. Beats by Beeman. I'm sitting here with Malcolm. We're talking about socially responsible investing. Malcolm, do you have any socially responsible investments?
Not on purpose. I'll answer it that way. I might, and I haven't, because like I didn't think of Apple as an ESG company.
Okay, that's fine.
So I probably do, but not because I intentionally say I have to save the whales or whatever else. Like people,
Right.
do you?
I don't know.
See?
I don't, not knowingly, and I have some that people might look at me like, wait, what are you about? So anyway,
I guess we're those kind of millennials.
we are those kind of millennials. So anyway, moving right along, how do we recognize, Malcolm, what a sustainable or responsible investment looks like? Like, what does it look like on its face, and then how are they constructed for consumers as investments?
Sure. So fund managers basically create either ETFs, exchange traded funds, or mutual funds that have a ESG criteria,
Right.
environmental, social, and governance. And I'll go through in a second what those actually mean, but basically they have their criteria of those three things that a company has to meet before it can go into a portfolio.
Okay.
And then they separate out the better performers, the stronger companies, the so on and the so on. But one thing I will mention is that those funds typically cost more.
Right.
So from a fund management standpoint, you kind of tie my hands as far as what companies I have available to invest in. And then you also make me do an additional layer of work to make sure that if that company falls out of its social governance standards,
It has to be taken out of the
It has to be
fund.
taken out of the fund.
Right.
But so just by looking for those ESG tags,
Right.
you actually do find, and there's probably like 200 or 300 different funds out there in the investment universe at this point.
Okay.
But real quick, what ESG is, so for the environmental criteria, it looks at how a company performs as a steward of the natural environment.
Okay.
So environmental criteria, energy use, waste, pollution, natural resource conservation, animal treatment, that kind of thing. The social criteria examines how a company manages with its employees, suppliers, consumers, communities where it actually operates physically. And so they look at a company's business relationships and that sort of thing. And then governance deals with the company's leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, shareholder rights, those kind of things. How are they treating the people inside? And all of those three things, they have a scoring rubric, and a company has to have a passing score on all three of those to be considered an ESG approved company,
Right.
to go into that ESG approved fund.
Okay.
So a lot of different hoops to jump through, you know, as a company. And I don't know that companies even intentionally go after that at this point.
Sure.
But you do have several companies that are working to help create like green technology, sustainable water filtration systems in
Right.
Africa and
Right.
those kind of things. Those kind of companies just automatically like fit in there,
Sure.
right? Like just based on what they do.
Right.
But then because you need some companies built in there that are going to actually make you some money,
Right.
the companies like Apple and Google and Amazon and
Fit
whoever else
into the
have to
model.
make themselves fit into
Right.
that ESG criteria. And so they have a whole layer of management whose job it is to make sure that they fall into
I didn't know that.
yeah, so they have their community and government affairs teams.
Okay.
The community and government affairs team for a major corporation like that, it's their job to make sure that that company has a footprint in the community. They're doing some good. They're
Right.
documented doing all these different things,
Right.
and passing audits and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So how do people kind of craft their own guide, so to speak, or their own theory of what it means for a company to be worthy of a sustainable investment? Like there can be it can be a gray area. So like what would be your thoughts really quickly on crafting your own sense of what it means to make a socially responsible investment?
And see, that's why it costs so much to have a professional fund manager do it.
Sure.
Because it is a gray area.
Right.
It is a lot of work.
Right.
And personally, I don't want to do it. So, like, you do have to do a good bit of research and reading to find that out.
Right.
Or you just buy a fund that's professionally managed by somebody else that's got that ESG logo
Right.
on it, or SRI, socially responsible investing. Those are kind of interchangeable.
And absolutely, we should remind people like in 401ks and IRAs and mutual fund accounts, you do get charged a percentage of your balance
Correct.
for management of that fund. And that's where there's a different price structure and pricing percentage for funds and that fund. And the way you explain it, first I have to research to see if it's going to make some money.
Right.
And then I have to see if it's socially responsible. That's two layers.
And then
hence-
how much does it cost?
And then how much does
Those
it
are called
cost?
the internal management expenses.
Absolutely. So those are three different things that impact the price of like you investing in this particular mutual fund, which in reality is another barrier to investing in at least these kinds of funds. So you have to do a whole lot of research to get into them appropriately. But real quick, with the few minutes that we have left, what would you suggest to people who are interested in like, crafting their investing strategy around sustainable investments and responsible investments?
So as you mentioned way back, my favorite website, Investopedia, because they just have like information on any and everything that has a $sign attached to it.
Sure.
If you just type in ESG, they will give you a list of all of the different funds out there and even help you track the performance over the last 10 years of
Okay.
what those funds have done.
Right.
Or you can type in SRI, socially responsible investing, into a place like that. You can Google it.
Right.
And it'll take you to all the different financial sites that have all those kind of things. But I just kind of would rather rely on a company like that that's a nonprofit that doesn't have a dog in the fight.
Right.
They don't have any stake in any of these different companies. So you can rest assured that the I don't want to say recommendations. The criteria
Sure.
that they're giving you is actually unbiased
Right.
Information.
Absolutely. Excellent advice and excellent explanation of what it means to be a socially responsible and sustainable investor. We want to thank everyone for watching this episode of Manage Your Damn Money. We also want to remind you that soon we're going to be doing a You Produce the Show. You meaning referring to our listeners and those who watch the show live and on our public broadcasting stations. If you have a suggestion of what you want us to cover or some question you have about money that you don't feel has been adequately answered, we're going to put those together in one show and answer those questions as best we are able to. Send your email and your thought to info@manageyourdamnmoney.com. There we will do it.
Also connect to us, share with us, follow us on social medias with an S on all the different social medias. Ben, what's yours?
My social media with no S is at MYDM1, and there you can find everything, including the picture of me and Tay Diggs, who is the same height as I.
And I'm at Malcolm on Money.
This is Manage Your Damn Money with Ben and Malcolm. We thank you for listening. Until next time, be good with your money.
Peace.
Peace.